All right, so our notes today are pretty straightforward, just a handful of Unit 1 key vocabulary terms. A lot of these will probably be unfamiliar to you. Some of them you may have heard before. We're at the beginning of the unit, so right now we're just focusing on getting the terms down and starting to familiarize ourselves with them. I'll read through them relatively quickly, so the video won't be that long, but pause it as you need to get the definitions down. All right, our first few are from chapter 38, and the first one is the Cold War. And the definition for Cold War is the hostile but non-violent struggle for power between the US and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies, from the end of World War II to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Cold War sounds like kind of an oxymoron, but it is a struggle for power like a war is, but we call it cold because it's non-violent. There's no fighting directly between the Soviets and the US. The second one is the Truman Doctrine. A doctrine is a statement of policy. So the Truman Doctrine is a US foreign policy named after President Truman that said the United States will provide economic and military aid to countries who resist communism. The Iron Curtain is number 3, and the Iron Curtain is the nickname given to the ideological barrier between Eastern Europe and Western Europe from 1945 to 1990. So during the Cold War, again, this is not a literal curtain. Okay? It is a symbol. It's made up, but is used to describe the barrier between the communist Soviet countries and the non-communist democratic countries. The Marshall Plan is the U.S. plan to aid in the economic recovery of Europe after World War II. And the Molotov Plan is basically the Soviet version, the Soviet plan to aid in the economic recovery of Eastern Europe. So the Marshall Plan was offered to all of Europe. The Soviets came back with the Molotov Plan, which was just for the Soviet countries in the East. Chapter 39 terms. Number 6, the Berlin Blockade. This was the nickname given to the Soviet blockade of Berlin, in which the Soviets blocked all land travel into the city in hopes of forcing the Western Allies, the US, Britain, France, to leave Berlin. The Allies resisted this by airlifting food and supplies. So they couldn't get in by truck or by train or by boat, so we decided to airlift food and supplies into Berlin. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This is a military alliance between the US and its allies for collective security against the Soviets. And the next one is the Warsaw Pact, which is the Soviet version, an agreement between the Soviet Union and its allies for mutual defense. So we have a Soviet version of NATO as well called the Warsaw Pact. Number 9, the Korean War. A war fought on the Korean Peninsula. That one's pretty straightforward. But it's not between the US and the Soviets. It's between communist North Korea, who was backed by the Soviet Union and China, and democratic South Korea, who was backed by the United States and our allies in the United Nations. Number 10, mutual assured destruction, sometimes called mutually assured destruction, or MAD, which is the thought, the idea that the US or the Soviets would respond to a nuclear attack by launching its own missiles. Right? That if one side launched, then the other side would respond by launching. And as strange as it sounds, that actually helped prevent the Cold War from becoming a hot war. Okay? Both sides knew that if they launched the missiles, the other side would respond and both countries would be destroyed. And that knowledge kept both sides from pushing the launch button. A couple more. Chapter 40, communist sympathizer. Pretty straightforward. Somebody who believes in the communist ideology, but is not a member of the Communist Party. Somebody who sympathizes with the communists, but they're not actually a communist. House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC. This was a committee of the U.S. House of Representatives that was in charge of investigating what they felt were subversive organizations in the United States. And this lasted until 1975. The last term is McCarthyism, which is the practice of publicly accusing people of subversive activities without having any evidence to actually back it up. And it was called this because of Senator Joe McCarthy, who used such tactics in the early 1950s as part of his strategy to root out and search for communists in the United States during the early Cold War.